and the slides with all the relevant links.
This meeting is being recorded.
Oh, there we go. We are being recorded, ready to be shared with the wider Frontline network after the event. The slides will be made available to you, and all the links to the relevant resources will be in there as well. So don't feel that you have to note down everything that we say. It will all be shared with you after the event. So welcome. We will make a start. So it falls to me to kind of set the scene. As Tim mentioned in the opening plenary this morning, we're led across the Frontline network by what we hear from you as frontline workers within the sector. So every year we run a frontline workers survey. Last year's survey ran November, December time, at which point the £20 a week universal credit uplift had just ended and people were starting to see the impact of that. And so even before Christmas of last year, the survey was already showing that frontline workers had concerns about the cost of living. As we all know, it's been widely documented that costs have been rising ever since. Inflation is currently standing at about 9%. And really we want to recognise as the Frontline network the impact that that's having on ourselves within the sector. So as frontline workers, the frustration and the difficulties that you may feel when you've sort of done everything you can, but you feel you've run out of options. So hopefully we've got some resources for you today to support you in that work, to recognise the impact that that is having on you, and support you to find some ways forward. We can start with some good news, so it's nice to be able to share a little bit of good news. I'm sure everyone is aware there was a national government announcement quite recently at the end of May that an additional package of support has been issued to support people with the rising cost of living. There's various lump sum payments and energy rebates coming to different sort of benefit entitlement groups and people in different sectors. And I think the really encouraging thing to note on that is that as long as people are sort of already eligible for universal credit, disability benefits, winter fuel payments, then these additional payments will reach people automatically. I think it's really nice to be in a position where people don't have to fill in additional paperwork, make more applications, provide ID, supporting information, all those kind of barriers that people can face. So that's obviously good news. Certainly some recognition from national government that costs of living are impacting people and that some support is needed. So we have a question for you. I think the fact that that package has been issued obviously suggests that the existing statutory benefit system perhaps isn't responding as quickly as we might like to those rising costs. So when we kind of were framing this session, thinking about what would we like the social security safety net to look like in a perfect world. So we'd really like to hear from you as frontline workers. If you could let us know how true you think these statements are in the existing system, and I guess thinking about the last 3 to 6 months and the current position that we're in. So from 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest, do you think people generally know what benefits they are entitled to? Are people then able to claim those entitlements? Are there significant barriers, or are people easily able to claim their entitlements? And when social security benefits are in payment, do those entitlements then cover the cost of living based on your experience? And I suppose thinking about the clients that you support. So Rachel, if you're able to launch our polls, they should pop up somewhere on the screen. Starting to get some responses, thank you. Okay, just to confuse things, I think the number rating is the other way around. So 1 is that it's true, 2 is that it's mostly true. So 5 is actually our lowest ranking, if you like. Yeah, so in terms of people knowing what benefits they're entitled to, yeah, fairly significant amount, so more than 50%, well, more than 60, if not 70%, yeah, saying that isn't necessarily the case with the people that we're supporting. Are people then able to claim what they're entitled to? Yeah, again, about 50% are saying no, that isn't generally the case that we're seeing. And then whether that covers the cost of living, yeah, I suppose really reflecting what we're seeing at the moment, that's again very heavily towards the untrue end of the scale, but that's obviously a struggle for people. Great. I've set myself a challenge now that I have to remember all those stats and refer back to them as we go through. But I think it's generally probably as we expected, that they are the sort of responses that we might expect to see. Thank you for your input on that. If you've got any further questions or comments that you'd like to add on those areas, then feel free to do so in the chat or the Q&A box on screen. But yeah, I'd like to bring in Michael, if I can, from Turn to Us. Good morning, Michael. And really to offer you an introduction, to let us know who you are, introduce some of the work that Turn to Us do. And an open question to you, what tools can Turn to Us provide that could help us as frontline workers to help people who might be entitled to benefits that they're not currently receiving? I think certainly the poll suggests that is a concern for people. So how can Turn to Us help frontline workers to support those people find out their full benefit entitlement? Michael, over to you.
Sure. So I think you might even have some slides in there. I think so here's who Turn to Us are bit, that we are a national charity providing, and I'm just going to move some of the Zoom furniture out of the way so I can see this. Providing practical help to people who are struggling financially. And it's a game of two halves, yeah. On the one hand, we do provide a lot of support so people can get access to welfare benefits, so that people can understand what charitable grants are available. And just to clarify that, by charitable grants, we mean grants to individuals, cash given to an individual as opposed to an organisation. And we provide a range of other kind of information and support. And we do this through, obviously, online. We also have a contact centre which answers questions about our benefit calculator and information and things like that, by the phone, by live chat, and increasingly through partner organisations. We are very, very much aware that an awful lot of the people who reach out to us, and going through the helpline records on a sort of like daily basis, I keep an eye on that. It's most of the conversations are people who are literally a paycheck or a benefit away from crisis. And increasingly we're finding that people are already tipped into crisis and are coming to us when things have already got very, very serious. The other side of what we do, of course, is give our own grants, and that's something which we've been doing a lot of work and reviewing of to see how we can do it in a much more equitable, focused, and fair way. So there's a number of programs we might touch on later where we've been hopefully learning how to give grants ourselves better, and we hope that we can provide that other people can learn from how we're doing things, and that hopefully we can learn from other people as well. Should we go on to the next slide? So I should probably run through our purpose, and the context for this is that Turn to Us has been through a bit of a journey in the last 120 years or so. That was when we were set up by a remarkable woman called Elizabeth Finn, who was one of those great Victorian philanthropists, diplomat's wife, Methodist, was still running the charity in the 1920s when she was in her 90s. But we've come a long way from the Elizabeth Finn Fund for Distressed Gentlefolk, which is where it started. And especially in the last 4 or 5 years, with our CEO, Tom Lawson, we've very much focused on shifting towards supporting people thrive and on really addressing the root causes of poverty. So we're looking not only to provide concrete help, but to try and influence and change the system, and to form coalitions and partnerships with people who are trying to do the same thing, because we see it as a systemic challenge, not something which has to down to or do with individuals. So we're very much focused on addressing life-changing events, but always in the context that there's a system problem there as well. And of course, I think lots of problems, examples of how that actually affects people. Shall we hop on? Okay. The practical stuff is our benefit calculator. We're not the only benefit calculator. There are other excellent ones. We think ours is particularly suited to individuals, though, to users, to people who just want to come online and do a benefit calculation. On the other hand, we also know that it's a complicated, messy business. So even completing it within the 10 minutes, people need to have a lot of information handy. If you're not particularly digitally enabled, that's where our contact center comes in. If someone is stuck on it, then after about 10 minutes, a few minutes or so, a live chat interface will pop up and allow people to directly ask questions of somebody in the contact center. People can also phone up and do calculations online. There's a bit of a problem with that. When the recent government announcements took place, for example, our call queues spiked at about 1.5 hours to get through. So we definitely have resourcing challenges, and there's definitely a huge need. We did about 2 million completed calculations, which, given that we reckon, and I know that there are a number of different stats around this, that there's about 15 billion in unclaimed benefits, I would say that suggests that an awful lot more people need to be doing benefit calculations than actually are. Shall we click on?
Yes, I think that was our last point from you.
Excellent. Oh, I forgot to mention Grant Search in that case. Grant Search is another service accessible through the same website as a benefits calculator. And that's basically a searchable database of about 1,600 different individual grants that people can go through and apply for. And again, support from the helpline is added. I guess we can take the question about the helpline number later.
Fab, thank you. Yes, I think we come back to the grant search as well as part of the later part as well. Could I just ask you, Michael, in terms of the benefit calculator, just thinking from a homelessness perspective, there's sort of lots of quirks within the system. So, for example, obviously housing benefit is a legacy benefit, but if people are experiencing homelessness and are housed in temporary accommodation, then housing benefit is still what's claimed. Does the calculator sort of accommodate all those sort of odd quirks?
It accommodates them to the extent that the system is able to accommodate them. Sure. If there's a quirk in the system where someone will fall through the crack, then whilst we're signposted, we'll do the best we can. Yeah, we can only follow how the actual system works. I mean, that's when we have two specialists whose job, and of course CPAG is an entire organisation that works around this, is just to track what is going on in the benefits system, to talk to DWP, to keep the calculator up to date. So in as far as the system is able to accommodate people, and that's why we talk about the fact that we need to have a bit of systems change, it will deal with that. When the system falls down, then the calculator is unfortunately stuck.
Yeah, so it tries to be as complex as the system is, I suppose,
but in a more usable way in terms of calculating what you're entitled to.
Lovely, thank you. Yeah, I think Dan, that probably brings us on to you and your work within CPAG. If I could bring you in, I suppose thinking about the amount of change that we see in the benefit system. I know certainly during the pandemic response, those first couple of months, it was kind of non-stop change. There was all kinds of things changing all the time. So if I could ask you to, I'll scroll through to my next slide. In terms of the work that CPAG do and the kind of resources that you can offer to help us as frontline workers to stay informed about those benefits, about the ongoing changes, your thoughts about what kind of level of expertise of benefits knowledge is needed in the sector. So yeah, if I could hand over to you to give us an introduction and share more on that, that would be great.
That'd be great. Thank you very much, Zoe. Would you mind rolling forward one slide? I think there's some slides from me in the pack. There we are. Yeah. First of all, hello, everybody. And thank you very much for coming along today. And thank you, Zoe, for inviting me. I'm going to talk a little bit. I work for the Child Poverty Action Group, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Child Poverty Action Group in a moment and some of the work that my team, I'm the head of advice and rights here at CPAG, and I'll talk about what our team does in a moment. And then I think there'll be a chance in a couple of slides time to talk about some of the support that we can offer you guys as frontline benefits or people who work with benefits. You don't have to formally call yourself a welfare rights advisor. As long as you're working with somebody on benefits, then we'd be pleased to help. So CPAG has been around for about 55 years. We date from back when welfare rights was delivered from a handcart, as you can see in the photo, by what looks like either Jeremy Corbyn in earlier years or possibly Eric Clapton, to a cutting edge team there who is wearing a stripy V-neck sweater and a tie. So we've been around rather a long time. We work to understand the causes of poverty and to develop and promote solutions to the problem of child poverty. And we work on behalf of the 1 in 4 children in the UK who live in poverty. That's 8 children in every classroom in your school, in your child's classroom, or your family member's classroom. 4 million children in the UK live in poverty. And those bold figures hide some quite pernicious trends. So almost half of the children who come from a BME background live in a household which is below the poverty level. Half the children who are whose parents, or who have a lone parent, as it were, live in a lone parent household, again fall into the below poverty levels. And half of what we call the larger families, and that means families with 3 or more children, again fall into poverty. 75% of the children in poverty are from working families. So we're not exclusively concerned with unearned or unwaged or non-earning families. CPAG collects evidence of the causes of poverty, and we promote achievable long-term solutions. We've been talking recently about a restoration of the link between the cost of living and the value of benefits. Of course, we're pleased to see that the Chancellor has returned to that principle for the next time round. Benefits go up in April next year. And we'd like to see a link between restoration of the link between the need and entitlement. So we've largely, during CPAG's 55 years, worked with means-tested benefits like universal credit, income-based benefits, where the principle is that we will calculate what you need to live on, or the government will look at what your income actually is in reality, whether that's benefits or some earnings, and then pay the shortfall. And that link has been cut in the last few years. Principles like the 2-child rule, local restrictions on the amount of help that's available in the private sector for rent, the benefits cap, all cut that link and leave families, particularly larger families or families living in expensive areas to live in, and that's most of those areas these days, are now no longer getting adequate benefits. We call for better administration of the benefits system. So specifically, at the moment, we'd like to see the rollout of managed migration to universal credit, which is bearing down on all of us, to be postponed until there was better evidence to see that could be carried out without people losing their benefits and falling into destitution. And we'd like to see an improvement in the extent to which childcare costs for employed workers on universal credit is paid, the level at which it's paid. We lobby the government for change. So we put submissions into inquiries, we have meetings with government ministers, we give evidence to Parliament, but also we provide practical support. And I'll talk about how we do that with benefits in a moment, but a couple of the other projects we're doing, we have a project called the Cost of the School Day, and that helps parents and schools to manage and limit the costs of educating your kids, of getting through the school day, so things like uniform and trips and end of term celebrations and so on. And we've also got a project called Your Work, Your Way, and that's looking to support second earners, so that's the second earner in a household, largely often the woman, a lady or woman in the household, the mum, typically, although not always, and then also to understand the barriers that those women, predominantly women, face in getting into employment. And when the government doesn't listen to us, when we finish lobbying the government, if they don't listen, then we take them to court. And you may have heard of CPAG's role in some legal cases. We were involved in the legal case which led to better provision for people who are not paid monthly and claim universal credit. So people who are paid a little bit earlier when their payday falls on a bank holiday or falls at the weekend. And we also were involved in a legal case which led to a relaxation of the bedroom tax rules for carers of severely disabled children. Our ongoing case on the benefit cap is now rolling on to Strasbourg and the European Human Rights Court. So we do quite a lot of legal action as well to try and effect change. Could I ask you to go forward a slide? Thanks. And then there's the team that I run, the Advice and Rights team. We are 17 benefits advisors these days, and our role is to support the advice community. And that includes you. Whether you call yourself a benefits advisor isn't really the point. It's whether you work with somebody professionally or as a volunteer who's claiming benefits. If you work to support them, then we're here to support you. And the primary way we do that is by providing advice services. There's a little slide picture there which says help for advisors, and we provide advice. It's free. It's available by telephone or by email every day of the week, and we have a specialist universal credit advice services, and we have the telephone line which will deal with all benefits, including the disability benefits, personal independence payments and tax credits and so on and so forth. So we provide lots of advice. We write a lot of books, and I'm just going to hold up the Bible of benefits advice. This is the Welfare Benefits and Tax Credit Handbook. If you are a benefits advisor, then you ought to have a copy of this on your desk. We were talking earlier on, I think, in the poll about whether or not people understand their entitlements, and I think I can illustrate why they're having such difficulty in understanding their entitlements. If you just consider this book for a moment, this is the 23rd edition, I think, of this book. It's about 1,800 closely worded Bible pages long, and it will set you back £69. It's well worth it, I'm duty bound to tell you. If I take an illustration, that's what it takes to currently describe the system. This is the first edition of the same book. It dates from 1972, so it's just a little bit younger than me. It cost 25 pence, and it summarized the entire benefit system in 69 short pages. It looks a bit like my school rough book from when I was still being taught French. So if you want an illustration of the difference, of the complexity of the benefit system, there it is, literally in inches. It's got about 4 inches more complicated over the course of the last 50 years. So no wonder people find it so difficult to understand their entitlements. We also publish other books, which you will no doubt find useful, the What You Need to Know series, which includes work on universal credit and winning your appeal and financial help for families, all really useful practical support, and not quite at the advanced level, the comprehensiveness that this book aspires to. We publish the Welfare Rights Bulletin, so if you're interested in being up to date with what's going on in an ever-changing and evolving benefit system, as Zoe said earlier on, it's really, it's very much a changing system, and a rapidly changing system as well. I've been a benefits advisor for about 1,000 years, and the last 10 years have been certainly the most rapid period of change. We provide training. Any of you who have ever been to CPAG training may have met my colleague Martin there, who's a benefits advisor, and he does some training on the higher level sort of legal stuff. So he trains on appeals to the upper tribunal and finding the law online and that kind of thing. And then finally, I'll talk about the early warning system in a while, but then finally, we run a series of seminars and conferences. And these are available. The conference will be in November, and we'll look, no doubt, at cost of living and managed migration. So that's the process of transferring the remaining legacy benefit claimants onto universal credit. And we run also regular seminars. So the seminars are an opportunity to do a deep dive into a specific area of benefits. We've looked at EU migrants in the past, and the next seminar, which will be in early July, if you're not doing anything on the 8th of July, and that will be looking at young people moving from being part of their parents' benefit claim into making their own claim, and also the difficulties that students, people who are known as receiving education in universal credit, and specifically disabled students who've seen a lot of changes, a lot of restriction on their entitlement to universal credit, and what they can do to stay in education and stay on benefits to the extent that that's possible. So we're here to support you, and we hope, and I'll talk in detail, if Zoe give me a moment, if I haven't spoken on too much already, I'll talk to you in a little bit a while about some of the tools and the sort of stuff that you can use to help you work with your clients. Thanks, Zoe.
Fantastic, thank you, Dan. It would be remiss of me to mention, for those who don't have a budget for training and are interested in CPAG's training or other training that's got a cost, I think Amanda is posting as I speak, the Frontline Network Training Fund, again, as a response to some feedback through the annual surveys in past years, is there for frontline workers to apply to directly. So if you're in the homelessness sector and you're looking for training, but there's a cost applied, then do have a look at the Frontline Network website and have a look at the training fund. Yes, thank you. Lots of support there. I think what always strikes me within the homelessness sector, hearing from frontline workers across so many different areas, I think frontline workers are kind of expected to be experts, or tend to feel that you have to be experts in so many different areas. whether that's sort of mental health support or substance misuse, domestic abuse issues, employment rights, and before you even get to almost the basics of sort of welfare benefits, in terms of that being obviously a key sort of amount of support for people who are going through homelessness and experiencing that situation. It's mind-blowing to me that the number of different specialties that frontline workers have to be involved in. So I think anything that can support frontline workers to understand the welfare benefits system and how that applies to their clients is obviously really useful. Michael, if I could bring you in and just to ask you about the advisor search that Turn to Us have. So if people feel that there is something more complex or that needs that additional kind of specialist support, I think your website's got some information about advisors. We'll just check your background noise. I think we could hear the level of demand on your helpline at the time, but yeah, that does seem a lot better now. Thank you.
I'm so sorry about that. I wrestled with Bluetooth for about 10 minutes and then discovered I could just close a door, which just says everything about my personal biases. Before I answer that, I just want to mention, I religiously shell out for CPAG's manuals in paper every year. And I must admit that occasionally people, third parties, commercial companies, give a bit of advice who come to us and ask for a meeting and say, so can you just explain the benefit system to them? And I do rather enjoy dropping that book in front of them. Okay, so I'd love to take credit for the advice system we actually have in terms of the list of different advice available from different locations, but we purchase it from Advice UK. It's their database. On the other hand, we pay for it and we put it out there for everyone to use, but it is very, very good. So if you'll find it on our website, and you can do a search by the category of advice, and by postcode to try and dive into where you might locally find a specific bit of specialized support for somebody who has a particular challenge. The one caveat I would say, and I think it reflects a wider problem, is that level of specialist support is a lot patchier than it was in terms of its regional coverage. I'd go so far as to say that the one-to-one advice sector in so many different areas has been really badly eroded over the last 2 years in particular, but I think that just highlighted a problem that was already starting to happen in terms of diminishing funds and support and buy-in to what are, I would say, very, very essential services. So you will not always be able to find the level of support or help on there that you might have expected to find even a few years ago.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Which I suppose brings me on to my little hat change. In terms of Citizens Advice itself. Obviously, I'm based at Coventry Citizens Advice, but I'm not a trained advisor. I don't work in advice provision directly. I run the Frontline network for people working in Coventry and the wider Midlands in homelessness. But we did want to sort of highlight some support from Citizens Advice as well. Obviously, it's always nice to go into meetings with the Citizens Advice lanyard because people tend to know what that means and who you are. But for those who don't know, we provide free, impartial and independent advice to members of the public, and that includes any member of the public, so you don't have to have recourse to public funds or a particular immigration status to access the advice. The advice is provided by local offices around the country. One thing to note is that Citizens Advice itself is sort of a national umbrella organisation, and then local Citizens Advice offices are all independent standalone charities, which talking about kind of different provision in different areas, that will explain why different offices run different projects, and you may find particular projects running in some areas which aren't always available in every other area. So please just be aware that each office kind of runs on its own independent footing. Having said that, at the national level, in England and Wales and Scotland, Citizens Advice currently runs the Help to Claim service, so we wanted to highlight that as a source of additional support for anyone making their initial universal credit claim. Fairly snappy web address there. The information is all available online. That support is available through web chat and by phone. So the DWP Commission service at the moment doesn't include any face-to-face advice, unfortunately, but I would signpost you back to the advisor search if that helps you sort of track down some further independent advice, which may be able to give face-to-face help as well. As I say, I'm not a trained advisor, so I'm not in a position to say whether somebody will be better off moving from legacy benefits onto universal credit. But what I can say is we would always recommend that you check. So get a benefit check, find some advice, get some support from someone who can really just check that it's worth moving, because you may see the phrase lobster pot used with universal credit. Essentially, once you've moved from legacy benefits, made that claim onto UC, you can get into it, but you can't then go back. So you can't change your mind if it turns out that you would have been better off staying on legacy benefits. And I think, Dan, you mentioned managed migration with UC, and there's lots of different things will apply depending on how you migrate and how you choose to move on to UC or otherwise migrated. So always worth getting a check before you kind of make that move. But yeah, the Help to Claim service is there to help people make their initial claim, and also to provide some support up until the first correct payment. So I think understanding sort of deductions and advance payments and all those kind of things as well, it might be a useful source of support for people if you struggle with the UC system in terms of helping your clients to access it. Also thought it was worth just highlighting from a homelessness perspective, some, I mean, not sort of magic words, but it's some phrases that are worth knowing, just to make sure that the advisors are aware that if someone is claiming UC and they're experiencing homelessness, or they're threatened with homelessness, going through that sort of homelessness application, looking for somewhere else to live, if they have work search requirements, you should be able to ask your job coach, your work coach, for an easement, which means that work search requirements will be switched off for a period of time, usually about a month. So that's worth knowing. The homelessness easements are discretionary, so it's up to each work coach to sort of review each case on its merits and make that application if needed. But there are some mandatory easements as well, and easements do apply for a range of issues. So things such as the structured treatment for addiction issues, if someone's experiencing domestic violence or has mental health concerns, there's various kind of easements. So I think where we're talking about, you know, social security benefits covering the cost of living, obviously if someone can avoid having sanctions and deductions made from their benefits, that's only going to be a good thing. So again, there's some a range of resources appearing in the chat that should send you over to various pieces of guidance and help that can help you with those particular issues. So if I can ask Dan from CPAG, we've kind of talked about making those claims. I think it's probably fair to say that advisors and support services here will have seen some issues in terms of people claiming benefits. So whether applications struggle at the first hurdle, or whether people aren't gaining full entitlement that they feel they should have to personal independence payments or those sort of conditional benefits. If I could ask you to let us know if there's some resources through CPAG in terms of helping us as frontline workers to resolve any problems that might surround benefit claims.
Thanks, Zoe. Yeah, that's really what one of the big outputs from my team. Just before I get onto that slide and to give you some stuff in detail, I just mentioned that I've put a link. I know Amanda's busily including resource after resource in the chat. It looks great. I put a link about additional payments, which are these extra payments of up to $650 for people on low income benefits, and then more for pensioners and some disabled people, and some general universal provision. Put a link in there. One thing to bear in mind, if your client is on housing benefit and housing benefit alone, they're not entitled, and in which case they'll need to go and talk to the local council about the Housing Support Fund as an alternative source of help for those people. Housing benefit is not a qualifying benefit. If you wouldn't mind rolling forward a slide. So I'll talk about some of the stuff that CPAG can help you with. So skill yourself up. This is, it's a phrase my son used to me. He's 10 and obsessed with football. He's derisory of my footballing skills, which he has a point. I'm not that good these days. And really that's what so the phrase is either he skills me up, which is when he does better than me, or he encourages me to skill myself up, which I think I mean practice and stop being quite so old. I think it's just helpful to illustrate how CPAG wants to help you. I've talked about the complexity of the benefit system and illustrated that with those 2 books. It is an increasingly complicated system. So he's touched on, for example, the discretionary rules around reducing work-related requirements, so work search, work-focused interviews. And just that area is in itself, it's a really complicated area, and it's getting more and more complicated. And we've also talked about managed migration versus what you might call voluntary migration. So voluntary migration, or if you have a change in circumstances whereby you need to claim universal credit, that's what's going on at the moment. We've got managed migration, which will essentially say to people, the benefits you're on at the moment, might be ESA and housing benefit, for example, for a person who's too ill to work. Those are going to end, and you've got a period of time in which you have to claim universal credit. And if you don't claim universal credit, your legacy benefits will end, and you won't have got a universal credit claim in, so you will miss out. My advice in that situation is, whilst there's a lot of caution if you're going to make a voluntary claim for universal credit, if you are approached or asked to make to be told that you must now make that move from legacy benefits to universal credit, and that is a process that's going to rapidly gather speed in the next few months. The government wants it done and dusted. That's 1.7 million households claiming benefits moved onto UC by the end of next year, and they're only now doing a little bit of a pilot to see how they get on in a couple of places, Bolton and Medway. So there's a long way to go in a rapidly decreasing number of working days. If you don't act, if you leave it, if you delay claiming, you won't have made a claim for universal credit, and you may well miss out not only on just the day-to-day money for yourself, but also the rent money, the money for your kids, and any help that's there in form of transitional protection, which is there to make sure that if you're subject to managed migration, in other words, you're compelled to move on to UC, that you don't lose out. That extra money called transitional protection, so that nobody loses out by the process of managed migration to universal credit, that can be lost if you don't make a claim in good time. So just encourage people to be aware that that's coming down the line, and if you've got clients, they need to be aware of the potential problem, not so scared off making a universal credit claim that they delay it. They may well cost them money. Looking at a few of the resources that we can help you with. So we've got some template letters, and this is a sort of fairly recent development, and they're all focused on universal credit. And unfortunately, the links don't work from the slides by the looks of it, the hyperlinks. But if anybody needs to find this stuff, either Google CPAG template letters or drop me a line. You can see my email address there, and I'll be glad to hear from you. The template letters are really around mandatory revision problems. So mandatory revision is the process of challenging a decision. So, for example, Zoe's talked about discretionary rules around easing the demand on people in a variety of circumstances, including being homeless, which will support them in limit the pressure they're under to turn up at the job centre, to look for work, and so on. Of course, the business end of if that goes wrong is that they get sanctioned if the discretion isn't used properly, if the demands on your client are too high and they don't meet those demands, then they're going to face a sanction. And mandatory reconsideration is the process by which you would challenge that sanction. In fact, you would challenge most decisions made by the Department of Work and Pensions. It's an internal review. And it leads on, once you've completed it in many cases, to a right of appeal. This is a complicated area. It's getting more complicated. Case law is developing all of the time, which has said, for example, that as long as you apply for your UC mandatory reconsideration within 13 months of the date of decision, you will get a right of appeal. That's been a recent sort of development in case law, and it's likely to be extended to tax credits. Well, there's a bit of case law that supports it. It's a less firm position. The template letters is designed for you to, they include these arguments, and there's a number of circumstances where you that might apply to your client, and you can fill in the details essentially. So you put your client's details in, and we've pre-written the argument for you. So that helps you if you're not so confident with benefits, with challenging decisions, or if you're in a situation where you feel a bit unfamiliar, then not only can we advise you on the telephone or by email, but we'll provide you with a letter that you can sort of use as the basis for your argument. We've got dedicated web pages, and these have really come into their own under the pandemic. They are in some sections of them are paid for, and you need to have a subscription, but you can get a free month-long subscription if you search for free Ask CPAG license, and I will point that you in the right direction if you can't find it. Includes lots of briefings, articles from our welfare benefits handbook, online versions of the content of the book that Michael was so kind to mention earlier on, and then looking at areas where there are particular issues like migrants, personal independence payments, debt, Scottish benefits, and that kind of thing. Lots of specialist areas. It's increasingly becoming more and more freely available. So we ask and we get sponsorship to make bits of it free. So for example, the debt handbook, if you're a debt worker or you work with somebody in debt, that's now available free through sponsorship from the Money Advice Service. And then we've got a couple of sort of specialist advice services, and they might be of use for you. You might be thinking this is getting a bit beyond my normal remit, and my boss is unlikely to let me take the DWP to judicial review in the High Court, and that's fine. We understand where you're at. The thing to remember with judicial review is that it gives you a right to challenge, or an ability to challenge, decisions like delay in making a decision on a mandatory reconsideration, delay on calling a medical, so your client is assessed for their ability to work. And the judicial review process, it involves essentially threatening the DWP in this case, or anybody else you're aiming your judicial review at, with a pre-action protocol letter saying, look, this is where we think you've gone wrong, and this is what we're going to do about it, and you've got a time limit to do that, otherwise we're off to the High Court. And those, again, we've got a bunch of template letters there which cover all sorts of areas: appeals, mandatory reconsideration, work capability assessments, a specialist area on domestic violence, for example, where there is a refusal to include those easements, which are available to both homeless people and survivors of domestic violence. Those letters are template letters. You populate them with your details. So it enables you, if you're not that confident, to start using the higher level means of challenging the DWP. And then, of course, if it all goes wrong, well, then you might end up in an appeal. You've been through your mandatory reconsideration. They haven't used the right level of discretion. They've sanctioned your client, and now you've been through the MR and you go to an appeal, but your appeal doesn't work. Many of you will have represented clients in appeals, and for many advisors, that's the end of the road. Nothing else we can do. That's the last bite of the cherry, as it were. We've got a project which will help you in that circumstance, and that's the Upper Tribunal project. There is another level of tribunal above and beyond the one that you may well be familiar with, and they can deal with cases where there have been mistakes made at the first tier tribunal, where the procedure has gone awry, or there's been an obvious level of unfairness or prejudice that might have impacted on your client, the decision your client gets. That guy that I showed you a photo of earlier on, Martin, he runs that project, and he's really keen to hear from you if you've been through an appeal and you don't feel your client got justice, and you want to know, is there a way of me taking this any further? How do I get a statement of reasons from the tribunal to find out why they made their decision? How do I go about making an appeal? And Martin will help you with the arguments, will help you prepare your case as well. So it's quite in-depth involvement. Just ask you to go forward one. I think we've got one more slide. Or if maybe I've done that. Zoe, could you go forward? No, that's it. That's that. So those are some of the resources that we've got. Just one other thing, we've done quite a lot of research on. We've talked about discretion in work-related requirements, and CPAG's done a lot of research on the plight of people, or the difficulties that people with mental health problems face when claiming universal credit. And in that report, we really advocate for the use of what's called reasonable adjustments, and these flow from the Equalities Act 2010. 10, and they impose on the DWP and other bits of government and public services the duty to take into account people's mental and physical health problems and to make reasonable adjustments. So, for example, if your client can't go for a work-focused interview in the mornings because that's when their mental health problems are particularly difficult, or if the demand that's made on them to attend the frequency of work-focused interviews or the demand to look for work 35 hours a week is too much for them, maybe they're pre-having a work capability assessment, pre-having a formal decision made, you have a look at that report and look at the way that reasonable adjustments can be used to sort of superpower your argument for a more friendly, more compassionate use of discretion. And yep, that would, and then I think Amanda's put a link up to that report, but if you can't find it, it's a really useful, just to get an idea of what the problems are for some people in this position, but what some of the solutions might be as well. So do have a look at that report. Thanks, Zoe.
Fantastic, thank you, Dan. Yes, I mean, I think, again, from a sort of homelessness perspective, there's lots of tools there to help us as frontline workers to support our clients. I suppose it's also worth saying that just sort of building relationships with your local job centre and partnership managers within DWP, you know, obviously the sort of judicial reviews and appeals are kind of the last resort, but there's scope there as well, isn't there? Just sort of strikes me really that we're all working to support the same people, and so I think I definitely recommend, you know, sort of reaching out to partnership managers within DWP and just seeing how all of those processes work, so that we understand, you know, everyone understands sort of the different roles within that system as well. Thank you. So I suppose in terms of our initial kind of poll, looking at whether people know what they're entitled to, I think generally we felt we don't, and Turn to Us has the benefit calculator to help us with that. In terms of making the claim and getting your entitlement in payment, we've sort of talked about the tools to make sure that claims are paid and that we resolve any issues with them. And I suppose that leads us on to the third point within that poll, in terms of whether we feel social security benefits are actually covering people's outgoings and the cost of living at the moment. And I think the initial poll kind of suggests that that isn't the case, but if we could launch another poll to hear from you as frontline workers supporting people in these scenarios, we'd really love to hear from you. How often are you assisting clients where generally their income isn't enough to cover their outgoings? And I suppose because we're talking about people experiencing homelessness and perhaps being less able to work, we're generally talking about people in receipt of welfare benefits in this case. But as a general kind of feel, yeah, so is it clients that you see that all the time where it's a struggle, pretty much quite a lot, now and again, or hardly ever? Yeah, so I think that's probably, if people can see those results, we're heading towards 50% of people where all the time clients are struggling to cover the cost of living with the income that they have. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, it's disappointing, it's not surprising. I think that's sort of what we're responding to here, that we suspected that this is the case, and certainly that's bearing out what we thought. So yeah, thank you for your input. If anyone has any kind of comments regarding what those key causes are, it would be really interesting to hear in the chat if you've anything to suggest. You know, whether it is the high cost of living, is it universal credit deductions for the advanced payments, is it previous debts? I don't know whether people are just going to write all of the above, but if there's any kind of key issues, it would be interesting to hear from people. You know, just to see if there's particular issues that perhaps we could find some more resources on and to help support you with, if it's the same kind of issues coming up over and over again. So I'll leave that to you in the chat if you'd like to contribute on that. Thank you. So I wanted just to cover, yeah, I guess where statutory benefits aren't enough, it's worth highlighting the discretionary help that's available. This is kind of the next step down, I suppose. It's It tends to be national government funding, but it's sent out to local authorities, so for councils to operate their own schemes and distribute it to their local residents as they see fit, if you like. Hopefully most people are aware of DHPs, so discretionary housing payment schemes. The clue in the name is that it's contributing towards housing costs. So to support people with additional housing costs, maybe it's LHA rates not covering rent, as we've talked about. Perhaps it's the benefit cap, meaning that housing benefit isn't covering the full rent. So your local authority should have a DHP scheme, and there's a gov.uk link there to find out what the scheme is in your area. As I say, I'm sure everyone here is aware of that, but it's always worth making sure that that's something that you are aware of and support your clients with. There is other local welfare provision, which is quite difficult to sort of pull together at a national level, because not only is it administered separately by each council, but they all tend to call it something different as well. Within Coventry, it's known as the Community Support Grant. So it may be something along those lines, or it may be called something completely different. But again, these are discretionary grants, which will cover things such as furniture, so basic furniture, white goods. This does tend to be very focused on kind of homelessness issues. So it will be people moving on from temporary accommodation, for example, into essentially a shell of a property and needing that kind of basic furniture to set up home. So again, worth being aware of that, finding out from your local council what support's available and what the best way is to apply for that. Wanted to highlight your local council may have a homelessness prevention fund. So as part of the funding for councils to operate the Homelessness Reduction Act services, so both prevention and relief of homelessness, depending on how your local council administers that fund, there may be some funding available to clients who have made a homelessness application and are going through that process. And finally, the Household Support Fund. Something that came out during the pandemic response to support people with the cost of living. This has now been extended to March 2023, which sounds a long way away, but will be here before we know it, I'm sure. And this is, again, national government funding that's been sent out to councils to distribute as they see fit, with some targeting. So a third has to go to families with children, a third has to go to households of pensionable age, which then leaves a third for remaining residents, perhaps singles or couples without children. And that can cover a whole range of kind of living costs. So it may be available for food, for utility bills, for clothing, for travel, and in extreme circumstances, some housing costs may be eligible as well. Again, it's being administered in different ways by different local councils. So it's all about sort of connecting with your local authority, finding out how that scheme is operating, who it's being targeted to, and how to apply. So that's kind of part of the cost of living response that came out as part of the recent packages as well. So that's kind of covered government funding, if you like. And I think within, Michael, as you've covered already, within Turn to Us, some of the other resources that you may have, if I could ask you to tell us about what Turn to Us can do to support us as frontline workers, to find other sources of financial help. So where we've kind of exhausted the statutory funding and the other government funding that's available, where can we turn next? Sure. If I could bring you in. Thank you.
Sure. Apologies for the slight gap in service. Technology seems determined to make my life a misery today. I just want to mention something else about, before I talk about Grant Search, our benefit calculator, referring back to the amazing list of resources that Dan went through. And one basic thing is, of course, understanding the information that people have put in when they apply for a benefit. And if you are a frontline worker, there's a different version of the benefit calculator designed to support you. You can log in as somebody who works for an advice-giving organisation, and you can save different benefit calculations for different clients you're working with, or several of the same version. Put that together with the fact that when someone's finished a calculation, you've got a downloadable PDF of all the different elements and information and how it all breaks down. Yeah, and it's quite a valuable tool for zeroing in on something which might be going wrong in the earlier stages of the processes that Dan was walking us through. So do be aware that that's there and that's available, and you can, register to actually use that. In terms of grant search, just to flip forward back to that slide again, we've and I think there's about 100 different grant sites. It's a tool whereby somebody can go there, they can answer a few basic questions, and it will give you a list of different grants you can apply for as an individual. The one thing that it does reflect is how complicated the grant giving sector actually is, in that depending on where you actually live, there may well be a cornucopia of grants to apply for, or comparatively few. The eligibility standards for each of them is going to be very, very different. The time it actually takes people to apply for a grant and get hold of one, that can be very different as well. An additional complicating factor is that many trusts, providers of grants, will only actually accept grants from intermediaries, from all the patriarchal figures you might actually expect. They won't actually accept grants from the individuals themselves. That's something, those are the kind of challenges which we're now trying to work for in terms of rethinking how we give grants ourselves. So historically, we've always as an organisation given grants. More recently, we've been working hard to cut down the eligibility requirements and to really target them for people who actually need them, whilst also focusing on making the process as simple as possible and co-producing that process and co-producing the eligibility standards with people who are representative of the target audience for those grants. The most recent grants we've been giving out have been sourced through the helpline, where the helpline advisors have been identifying people with particular categories and referring them through. The problem we have, of course, and it's the same problem which I think any grant giver actually has, is there are so many more people who need this kind of support than there are actual grants available. It is just another band-aid, all said and done. But where people have hit a wall with the benefits side of things, then going to grant search and seeing what might be available to apply for as an individual is, something very, very useful. For clients for people who are just applying it, looking through it themselves. And by the way, all our stuff is very, very mobile friendly. We try and design everything for mobile first now. The helpline live chat will appear if people get confused, because we're rebuilding it at the moment because it's not the simplest system in the world to navigate, which perhaps reflects just what a messy area it is. But I think that does about 1 million searches a year. It's a very untapped resource. We'd like to see people using it more.
Yes, yeah, fantastic resource. I think it's probably fair to say, obviously, not every grant will be on there. I know, no. I think certainly in Coventry, there's the odd charity and grant making scheme where it tends to be very word of mouth. So sometimes it will be a case of again getting out there. Yes, I suppose, yeah, if you can encourage local charities to sign up for it, it makes it easier for everyone to find. I mean, I appreciate there's always demands of sort of capacity, isn't there? It's that balance between letting everyone know who needs it, but not being overwhelmed with demand.
The one thing we can promise charities who put themselves on there is we switch them on and off. And we try and keep it up to date. Twice a year, we will try and phone everybody on that system to make sure whether they're available, whether there have been changes, things like that. So we do try and address, we're very aware there are two audiences there, the people who need the grants and the people who are providing grants, and we have to keep a balance which supports both.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I'll do a quick plug. Again, I think it's been mentioned this morning, but the Vickers Relief Fund, obviously St Martin's operate the Vickers Relief Fund as a small, quick grant-making process that can help people to either prevent homelessness or move on from homelessness. So do have a look on the Frontline Network website for information about the VRF, or click in the link as Amanda has just posted. Thank you, Amanda. Someone has actually mentioned the DWP Flexible Support Fund, which I guess kind of, again, is one of these discretionary things that's not very well publicised and perhaps not as widely known as should be. Certainly my understanding is it does still exist. So that's something that if someone is it's a DWP fund to help someone move more closer to work. So for things such as travel to interviews and that kind of thing is my understanding. But yeah, we'll gather some information on that and make sure that's included in the resources that are shared afterwards as well. Thank you for that question. So yes, I mean, I suppose that does kind of cover in a wider scale the discretionary and charitable funding, which perhaps in an ideal world we wouldn't need, but it's obviously really useful that it is there, and really important that frontline workers know it's there and how to access it. And really great to hear that the details are kept up to date as well, because I think there's nothing more frustrating than an out-of-date database, is there? So knowing that it's all maintained and that information is current is also really great to know. And I suppose just to kind of to wrap up that session, if I can bring both Michael and Dan back in, and questions for both of you really, to hear more from you about whether your current work suggests, our statutory entitlements and that other kind of government support and discretionary support. Do you feel it's enough to meet the cost of living? What are you hearing from sort of your service users and the agencies that you interact with? And what agencies can do if we feel frustrated, if we feel that there are issues that need addressing? How can we make sure that that's sort of gathered together and campaign for change where we think that is needed? So Dan, if I could ask you for your comments on that.
Yeah, sure. I'll be brief. I mean, let's face it. We know the answer. Are social security benefits adequate at the moment? Even with those additional payments, they're going to go a very short way towards meeting your energy bills. Never mind the other associated costs of living. Never mind the fact that people, because of those restrictions that I've talked about, and local housing allowance is useful in many of those circumstances. For example, when the help with your rent is capped because you live in an expensive area, are really useful. But we're in the context of which we're now facing a cost of living crisis, is one in which 40 billion pounds has been taken out of the social security system over the course of the last 10 years. If you sort of compare to purchase power, as it were, 10 years ago in the social security system, that's massively declined. It's wonderful to see that the government has found faith again in benefit rates keeping up with the cost of living, but that's not been the case for the last 10 years. And the value of benefits, for example, child benefit, has fallen 25% in terms of what it can buy over the last 10 years. That's and then it is no surprise then that the rules on or the facts and figures on child poverty is that child poverty remains a pernicious problem. It continues to rise, and that work, whilst it is good for many people for income reasons, but also for health and self-esteem reasons, isn't necessarily the solution, the silver bullet to solving people's poverty problems. As I mentioned at the beginning, 75% of the kids that are of the 4 odd million that are living in poverty are living in poverty in a household where an adult is working. How can you help CPAG? Well, I mean, maybe never mind CPAG for a moment. How can you help your client? Use our resources, turn to us as resources, use that opportunity that Zoe mentioned for free training. If you represent a community group in London, or if you know of one that maybe doesn't get any benefits training or doesn't have any money or can't access the funds that Zoe talked about, give us a shout. We do have a small provision for free training and bursaries for training. So we'd like to hear from you if maybe the Frontline Networks system can't accommodate your needs. And then just one other thing I'd like to highlight is the early warning system. So CPAG has been running this for about 5 years. We have a version as well in Scotland. So if you're a Scottish-based advisor, then have a look at the CPAG Scotland website. The website, the early warning system gathers examples of benefit problems. So poor administration, bad law, bad use of discretion, individual job centres not going rogue and setting their own sets of regulations or setting their own laws. We would like to hear from you. There are you can get in touch with us if you Google CPAG early warning system. You can submit your cases. We keep a record of these, and we use these to sort of illustrate our arguments, provide case studies or examples to the press. By the way, we will never use any case study you submit without checking with you and the client involved. So it's an entirely anonymous system. What we want to know about is the problems, not the names of the clients. Sign up for the bulletin as well. The EWS produces a regular monthly bulletin which talks about these issues and also talks about the solutions. So you might well find that useful. And then, of course, I put a note in there, make a donation. I have to say that my boss insists I do so. Perhaps if you're a hard-pressed organization or you're a hard-pressed individual, then come on a training course or buy one of our books or come to one of our seminars. And that way we would be grateful for the revenue, and we'd be grateful for the opportunity to add to your skill levels to increase your ability to support your clients. So thanks very much. Thanks, Zoe.
Great, thank you, Dan. Lots of useful resources there, and I think it's hopefully, sessions like this, we can't solve every issue, but I think it's nice to be heard. It's nice to to hear from frontline workers what those issues are, and to recognise that they are issues that sort of affect everyone working in the sector, and to know that there's some ways of kind of gathering that evidence together and feeding it through to a central point, really. So thank you. Michael, I think you had some sort of further stats to give us perhaps more context about the kind of scenarios that we're working with.
I'm afraid I always have more stats. I mean, I'm not going to read them all out because they speak for themselves. And this is a mixture of research we've done, cross-referencing it with ONS data and, of course, data from our helpline. The helpline is obviously something I'm quite close to in terms of monitoring what's going on for real claimants on the actual front line. And you can see some stats there. What I would say is that since these stats were first put together, I was looking at this last week, issues like support to access food, that's getting steadily much worse. I would say that we're probably hitting 10% of the people who go through the different circumstances that they are in who would mention difficulty in getting food as one of them. We're constantly seeing people who are making those choices. I don't know if you want to flip onto the next slide. I think I saw some, yeah. We've got some stories there. I wish I could say that these are unusual, but they're not. Every member of staff who works at Turn to Us when they first join, and at regular intervals afterwards, is required to go and sit in and listen for a couple of hours to the calls that are incoming, just to get a feel for what's going on and to keep, and to keep in touch with that. And that they all come back having heard calls like this. It's very, very challenging. I will provide the number, but I'll drop it in the chat. But the health warning is that whilst we managed to answer 100,000 calls and live chats, there are about, at the moment, 3 times as many people trying to call as managed to get through. Some of those might be repeat calls, but it's challenging. Yeah, there is that much of a demand for the kind of incredibly valuable one-to-one support, but I think this group provides, and it's just not available yet. I think in terms of resources that we can offer, and in terms of campaigning, I just reiterate everything Stan said. Use the resources, sign up for an account on the benefit calculator so you can keep records of what people are entitled to, so you've got an easy way to go back and cross-check things, identify where people might be going wrong, use the grant search resources, and all the actual campaigning opportunities that Stan spoke about. We're getting into steam with campaigning as well. We feed back directly to DWP. We like to think of ourselves as a critical friend. So if you have those horror stories and contradictions, and I should add, by the way, that about no small number of the calls we get are directly referred to us by DWP, who tell callers that we will give out emergency grants, drop them onto our lines and run away. There's a lot of rogue DWP call centres out there. Do let us know.
Yes, thank you. I mean, obviously we've not sort of mentioned that even, well, it's probably not even an informal support now, isn't it? But in terms of things like food banks, fuel banks, clothing rails where people share what they do have. I think we've kind of focused on the more kind of statutory and structured, I suppose, sort of financial support, perhaps, rather than goods in kind. And I think there's lots of, I mean, when we talk about sort of campaigning and gathering information, there's food poverty campaigns, there's fuel poverty, there's all kinds of, there's sort of subcategories of issues. But I suppose to me, it feels like it's all just part of a bigger picture. And And I think, Dan, you mentioned sort of the amount that's been taken out of the benefit system, but I think we did also mention in passing the amount of benefits that go unclaimed every year. I think we've seen estimates of something like 15 billion per year. So definitely, you know, sort of, I think we, as people who support clients in vulnerable situations who may be struggling, I think it's really important to be aware of what support is available and make sure that we go through those claiming processes with them, and then feedback about whether that process is you know, suitable and whether it works for people. Michael, you talked about sort of using co-production in your work as well, and making sure that people who use the services get to contribute to how it's designed, which is perhaps something that we'd like to sort of amplify from the Frontline as well. So that kind of brings us to the end of the information and resources that we had to share. I'm completely oblivious as to what time we're meant to finish. I don't know whether it's 12:30 or 1:45, but I'll have a quick look at the Q&A and just see where we are. Okay, so we've got another 15 minutes or so. Lovely. So if I can just, I'll have a quick scan through the questions, and chair's prerogative, I get to pick ones that we'd like to talk about. We have had a question about new style JSA. Which just catches my eye because it feels to me as if it's a benefit that perhaps people aren't aware that they can claim. I don't know, Dan, whether you're able to share some information about new style JSA.
So I'm a manager of benefits advisors, so as I'm sure they'll all tell you, I don't know anything about benefits. I'm just trying to get people who do know a lot about benefits to do the things they don't want to do. I'll give it a go. New style ESA, I think, it's a DWP term really for the version of job seekers allowance that survived. Was it JSA or ESA? Sorry, Zoe.
JSA was the
JSA.
question,
Okay. The principle applies to new style ESA as well. So I've talked a bit about managed migration. Michael's talked about using the calculator, Turn to Us calculator, which I used as a benefits advisor throughout my career, and is very useful, I should say, to try and assess whether it's a good idea to move on to universal credit. And so there's this question of what is universal credit replacing? It's not a universal benefit. It replaces the 6 big means tested benefits. So income-based job seekers allowance, income-based employment and support, income support, housing benefit, and the 2 tax credits, child and working tax credit. So what survives that? Well, first of all of the statutory benefits like statutory sick pay or statutory adoption or maternity pay that you get paid through your employer. The non-means tested benefits, so that's like benefits like disability benefits or child benefit, which are paid really according to whether or not you've got a child or whether you've got sufficient levels of disability. And then you've got the versions. I talked about income-based ESA and income-based JSA being replaced by universal credit. There are alternative versions of that benefit, those 2 benefits, and one of them, and those are called new style JSA, new style ESA, or contribution-based ESA or contribution-based JSA is probably a more accurate term. And what they are is the versions of the benefit, those benefits, one for people who are able-bodied and looking for work, and one for people who are too ill to work, either permanently or for a temporary period in the case of ESA. That's for the people who've paid national insurance contributions. So let's take for me, for an example, I work, and I've worked for about 1,000 years, it feels like. If I were to get sick, I would have to claim what is called contribution-based job seekers allowance. I might look to claim universal credit to top that money up, but that wouldn't be available to me because I've got a working partner, and it would make it difficult for me to get that benefit. And also they might look at sort of any savings I have, that kind of thing. The contribution-based versions of these benefits have not been replaced for universal credit. You can still make claims for those benefits. In order to get them, you have to either be looking for work or too sick to go to work, but you also need to have made your national insurance contributions. So that's why I might get them, whereas I wouldn't get, whereas somebody who without a working history, without national insurance contributions over the last couple of years, it is generally, would be able to claim, would be unable to claim those benefits. So they're the versions of the contribution-based versions of some familiar benefits which have survived universal credit. And if, for example, your client is currently working and is unable to work in the future because they fall ill, they might well be entitled to the contribution-based version of ESA, or if they're a job seeker and able-bodied, the contribution-based version of job seekers allowance, and then maybe get universal credit as a top-up, because it's quite a limited amount of money. It's for one individual, not the whole family, and it certainly doesn't have any money for things like rent or extra costs of childcare. So you might well need child benefit. Sorry, you might well need universal credit as a top-up on top of that benefit. So I hope that answers your question. I don't know if there were any more specifics to the question, but hopefully that's helpful.
Yes, it was an open question to tell us about New Style JSA, and as you say, I think there's similar principles for New Style ESA as well.
And yet there's more expertise going into the, if you're interested, there's lots of really useful stuff being put that I haven't been able to cover. Elaine, thank you very much, in the chat.
Yes, I mean, thank you everyone who's shared resources and comments. Really useful to see the kinds of issues that that people are dealing with. We've had I guess more a comment than a question, but in terms of appealing sanctions, I suppose we've kind of covered resources and letters that you can that frontline workers can use to help with that work. I suppose
sorry to interrupt, 2 points I would make on appealing sanctions. First of all, there is no time limit. You can appeal a sanction that's 10 years old if you can find one. The second thing is that if you sanctions stack, so the more you commit your crime, the more you commit the offence, the more you fail to do what's expected of you. In some instances, not always, if you do so again within, I think it's within a year, then the sanctions get worse. So even if your client is banged to rights, definitely kind of is deserving of the sanction in front of them, you might go and look at the previous sanction. If you can challenge that decision, then you can reduce the impact of the decision that's in front of you that you're kind of prepared to accept. So just that really important point is that there is no time limit on appealing sanctions. So you don't even need to worry about the 13-month deadline for asking for a mandatory reconsideration. Thanks.
Fantastic. Yeah, really useful information. Thank you. I certainly wasn't aware of those finer points of the policy. I suppose I was just thinking again from a homelessness and support agency kind of perspective. I mentioned before sort of about liaising with your DWP partnership manager and sort of building those relationships with work coaches. And I suppose it's always worth being aware that as support agencies, you've got that additional information to help explain why people might need an easement, might need sort of reduced conditionality in terms of their work searches. And I think, again, we've had resources in the past about template letters there for kind of saying this, these are the needs that my client has. Please bear them in mind when setting sort of work search conditionality and those kind of UC entitlements and the obligations on people. So just wanted to highlight that as well. Let me have a quick look at the Q&A, see what else we might be able to pick up. There is a question there about whether citizens' advice where a particular local office perhaps doesn't offer a certain project, but that's something that your client needs. I will take that point away and try and provide some feedback to explain exactly how that might work, as I'm not particularly close to the actual advice provision side of things. So I'll pick that up and try and answer that one offline. A question regarding mandatory reconsiderations. Should clients receive a notice through their UC processes? Advisors are seeing just one line sort of input on their UC journal. So should clients expect a full official letter before they can move on to an appeal process?
Yes, they should, but maybe they don't get one. So yes, in practice, you ought to get one. What's important is to have a quick think about, or if you have the time, to have a quick look at the law. And if you think this is a big book, you should see the legal books, the books of the law. But what the law says is that the critical point here is, when does your appeal rights arise? So if you are, for example, trying to challenge the outcome of a work capability assessment that says you have you're not sufficiently ill to have a limited capability for work, and that means that you are potentially on the business end of all work-related requirements. You've got to spend 35 hours a week looking for work. You need to be able to accept a job the next day, up to 90 minutes travel away, regardless of how much they pay you, and so on and so forth. If you're on the if you're challenging that, the first thing you're going to do is ask for a mandatory reconsideration. The reason you're asking for the mandatory reconsideration is twofold. First of all, it might get the decision changed. In about, I mean, this is a ballpark figure, but 30% of cases, 30% of decisions, or where a mandatory reconsideration is requested, the DWP do change their mind. So they will listen to reason, and it's often an awful lot quicker to get them to change their mind than to wait for an appeal judge or a panel of the appeal panel to make a decision and tell the DWP to change their mind. So if you can get the MR, the mandatory reconsideration, as the point of change, it's well worthwhile. But if you, what will happen by requesting a mandatory reconsideration, you are giving rise to a right of appeal. So the legislation says something like that: if a right of appeal, in other words, the capacity to go to a judge and get an independent decision made by somebody who's not employed by the Department of Work and Pensions and is an expert on social security law, the ability to get that right of appeal only arises in many instances. There are exceptions, but in many instances it only arises if the Secretary of State has received a request for a mandatory reconsideration and has considered whether to award one, to make a mandatory reconsideration. So that is all that is required for a right of appeal. It's not possession of a mandatory reconsideration notice. It's not a particular type of letter. It's just that you've asked, and the Secretary of State, through her minions at the job centre, or wherever they do these things in their offices, has considered, should we or shouldn't we revise this decision? And this is why nowadays, if you put in an appeal, a request for a mandatory reconsideration outside of a month, but within 13 months, even if the DWP decides, well, your reason for being late, for being outside of the normal statutory month, but within the 13 months in which we've got to weigh it up, well, that is the weighing it up. It doesn't matter whether they decide you've got good reason or not. You've had they have done some reconsidering, and therefore a right of appeal arises. So if you have got a decision where you think you've asked for a mandatory reconsideration, and they've done some thinking about it. They have written to you, they've written on the journal, thanks very much, we've had a look at this, we've decided not to change our mind, or something along those lines. That's evidence that a mandatory reconsideration has taken place. You don't need a mandatory reconsideration formal notice to go and get that right of appeal. So in that circumstance, I would print the journal, or I would print the evidence that you've got that some sort of reconsideration has been done at your or your client's request, and then go to the HMCTS, that's Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service, who administer Social Security appeals, and challenge and say, I would like an appeal hearing. I would like to launch my appeal. I've asked for a reconsideration. The Secretary of State's had a think about it. She hasn't changed her mind. I'd like an appeal. Those template letters I talked about right at the beginning when we were talking about resources, those template letters, several of them, address this exact issue where you've asked for an MR and they've not given you the right paperwork. What do you do next? Well, all you've got to do is find those letters, Google template letters CPAG, or give me a shout, and you can pop in your client's details and the letter writes itself for you, if you see what I mean. So yeah, don't be put off by DWP shenanigans about mandatory reconsideration. Once they've had a think about the decision, as long as they do so within 13 months, and in some instances like sanctions, there isn't even a 13-month deadline, then you've got a right of appeal that flows from there. So don't be put off, and if you do, give us a shout, we'll gladly help you.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, again, lots of sort of finer points about the legal requirements, and I'm again struck by the amount of information that as frontline homelessness workers you need the basic grounding to even know, is something right or wrong, let alone how to then take it forward and challenge it in the right way. Yeah, again, I mean, I've never worked in a frontline role myself, so my experience is from hearing from frontline workers, and just the breadth of information that people are expected to have a grasp of is just enormous. So I take my hat off to everyone doing the role. I guess we're probably about to wrap up in the next couple of minutes. Amanda's just posted some information about this afternoon's sessions, so more of a sort of well-being focus, looking at sort of time management and reflective practice and support as a frontline worker to support your well-being whilst you're dealing with all these complex issues on behalf of your clients. I'll do a quick plug for all the other sessions. Thank you for issuing them in favour of our session this morning. I hope you found it useful, but you can catch up again on Catch Up. It will be everything will be recorded, so you can go back and review those sessions. I'm aware that as we've kind of focused on social security benefits, it's naturally had I suppose the effect of excluding people who don't have recourse to public funds from these discussions. So if that's a particular topic that you're seeing issues with, Praxis, we're running another session this morning specifically about NRPF, immigration issues and what support's available for clients in that situation as well. So I thought it was just worth noting because we haven't explicitly kind of said, obviously people will need to have the legal recourse to public funds to access most of this support, perhaps not all. That's maybe another point of sort of fine detail as to which benefits people can apply for in different situations. So again, I would again point you back to the Turn to Us advisor search and the Citizens Advice website. There is, as I said, there was a question about sort of different local projects for different Citizens Advice offices. Obviously, the National Service does have the citizensadvice.org.uk website with all kinds of advice on there, specifically with benefits advice, but I suppose there's everything kind of intersects. So you've got kind of debt advice, employment issues, housing law, all those subjects that intersect and can contribute to somebody experiencing homelessness. So do have a look on the National Citizens Advice website as well. Plenty of advice there. But yeah, I think if I can ask Dan and Michael if you've got any further comments to add.
Shall I go first? Just to say thank you all very much for listening so patiently. I'm going to put one very selfish plug in. I think Michael might be about to do the same thing. If your takeaway from this session is I'd like to work for CPAG and I'd like Dan as your boss, then well, blimey, really. If you are interested in working for CPAG, then we've got a couple of jobs out. We're partnering with Trussell Trust to do some what's called second tier advice in food banks. It's a really interesting development. So if you are interested, or you know a welfare rights advisor who's looking for work, then have a look at our web pages and actually, by the looks of it, have a look at Michael's as well. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Basically what Dan said. I think the other thing I'd say is do make use of the benefit calculator, but be aware of its limitations. It will tell you everything you need to know, provided someone has put in the correct information. It can help you if you have that ground floor level understanding of the benefit systems to know where somebody might have gone wrong. For the complex stuff, definitely Dan and his team are your people.
Lovely. Yeah, thank you both. I think a wealth of resources there. Do tell a friend if this is useful. Obviously share those resources as widely as you can to make sure that everyone who's entitled to the support gets the support, can access it, can challenge anything they think is wrong, and then can make use of the discretionary grants to top up whilst costs are a challenge. Thank you, everyone. I hope that's been useful. I can see people are ready to head off for a lunch break before joining us for this afternoon's sessions as well. So thank you, Michael. Thank you, Dan. Thank you to our behind the scenes Frontline Network colleagues who've been monitoring the chat and the questions. Amanda's posted a wealth of information which we will gather and collect as part of the presentation and the resources that we make sure everyone can access after the event. So yes, thank you for joining us. I hope that's been useful, and I hope to see you again this afternoon for the rest of our conference. Thanks all.